Electric cars are awesome. They really are. They're more affordable to operate, they require less maintenance, and of course are responsible for less pollution over their lifetime than an internal combustion engine vehicle. They're often quicker than an internal combustion engine car. And they're super easy to drive. And when it comes to driver fatigue, studies have shown that EV drivers tend to suffer less stress behind the wheel than their internal combustion engine counterparts. But, as I am sure most of you know, electric vehicles are also sadly more expensive to buy brand new than most internal combustion engine vehicles. While price parity is just a few years away, the sticker price of most new EVs is out of the price range of a large proportion of the population. And yeah, things are getting better. Used electric cars are now available at price points that are within the reach of more buyers than ever before. But while some used electric cars are now as affordable as comparable internal combustion engine vehicles, and can be far more reliable to boot, a complete lack of investment in electric vehicle charging in historically disinvested neighbourhoods means that we are facing down the barrel of a major urban charging crisis. Specifically, urban charging deserts, areas of major cities where there is little to no electric vehicle charging provision, meaning people who might be able to afford a used or brand new electric car aren't finding that they can use one because of a lack of charging infrastructure. And as a recent report by the Rocky Mountain Institute shows, this already pressing problem will only get worse unless we tackle what I'm going to call EV gentrification. Luckily though, as the report also points out, one answer to that problem could be a shift in rideshare services to an all-electric fleet. So today I'm going to talk about the problem of urban charging deserts and EV gentrification, and specifically I'll examine what issues there are, talk about how we got there, and ask how we can move forwards. But first, let's talk to EV affordability and deal with a comment I know that we're going to have. In fact, I'm pretty sure we'll have 1,000,001 people commenting in the comments about how we are clearly wrong about EV affordability because the average new price of a car in the US is more than the entry-level price of a brand new Tesla Model 3. If that is true, they say, then clearly EVs are affordable. That argument is flawed. First, those statistics usually reflect the median price, which is what you get if you add up all of the sticker prices of every car sold and then you divide it by the number of cars sold. Examining a median figure does not take into account the fact that a couple or thousand of high-end sports cars can skew the entire end figure upwards. Nor does it take into account the rising subprime crisis in the auto industry. People today are entering into ever longer lease and purchase deals on brand new cars to just be able to manage the monthly payments. But that doesn't make those cars more affordable. It means people are being forced to buy more expensive cars with incredibly high interest rates or long terms because that is the only option they have. And of course, that average new price refers to new cars, not used. And statistics show that people are keeping their cars longer than ever before, partly because buying a new one costs so much. And no, you cannot use post-incentive pricing to argue a point, because in some countries, like the US, incentives require you to actually have a tax liability large enough to use the credit to offset. So you still need the cash, or good enough credit, up front. Okay, back to EV gentrification and urban charging deserts. And if we're going to talk about EV gentrification, we should make sure we understand the term in its usual context, neighbourhood gentrification. Gentrification refers to the process of taking an historically disinvested neighbourhood and then injecting high amounts of real estate capital, usually from outside non-local sources, to attract more affluent, higher-income residents to move there. Houses are torn down or gutted and rebuilt into trendy apartment complexes, and well-known grocery store chains, wine bars, restaurants and fast food outlets move into the area to satiate the needs of often, but not always, young professionals moving to the area with lots of disposable income and very little interest in their local community. Gentrification often coincides with a wave of racial readjustment, and an area may see long-term residents that are people of colour moving out while white people move in. These communities that are so attractive to buyers with their stock of cheaper historic housing and vibrant, culturally diverse stores and restaurants are often a result of historic redlining and modern discriminatory lending. For those who don't know, in the 1930s, the US federal government's underwriting manual, that's the rules for providing mortgages, stated, quote, incompatible racial groups should not be permitted to live together in the same communities, which in practice meant redlining denied mainly black people the ability to buy houses outside certain areas, and with discriminatory lending continuing even now, these federal policies continue to have impacts, despite redlining technically now being illegal. Alongside that shift in demographics, independent local businesses that have existed in the community for years often find themselves unable to compete with their new high street rivals as loyal customers leave. Residents who grew up in the neighbourhood find they can no longer meet the cost of living there due to increased rent. And those who are lucky enough to own their own home often find that their home has increased so much in value that selling up and moving out is too much of a good financial windfall to pass up. The original disinvested community, which rarely receives any of the actual investment that gentrification brings, finds itself splintered, disenfranchised, and ultimately destroyed. I'm sure that by now many of you know what happens next. Those who lived in the area pre-gentrification find themselves forced to move further out of town, requiring them to travel longer distances for work. They may even have to find new jobs. All too often, displaced community members find that they end up relocating to somewhere where they are worse off financially than they were, all because some dinky couple, that's dual income, no kids, want to live in an historic neighbourhood but also want to get their fair trade ethically sourced out-of-season vegetables from the new local Amazon-owned grocery store down the street, while talking with their friends over coffee about that time they went to Africa in high school to build a well for poor people. EV gentrification is a little similar, and it goes something like this. Affluent neighbourhoods historically have had more electric vehicle owners in them than less affluent areas, and more EV adoption means more likelihood that electric vehicle charging infrastructure will be provided. Additionally, more affluent areas are more likely to have the money to invest in EV charging. More infrastructure encourages more people to dump the pump and make the switch, and you're left with a self-sustaining EV adoption. But there's a nasty unspoken truth here. Charging infrastructure companies install EV charging stations where they know electric car owners will want to stop for half an hour or more. And given the socioeconomic makeup of much of the EV-owning population, well, those charging networks self-select locations that are considered more upmarket. And that leads us to something called urban charging deserts. Areas of towns and cities where there is little to no charging infrastructure for electric vehicles. And you've guessed it, those areas tend to be areas of historical disinvestment. Of course, when it comes to EV ownership, if you do not have a place to park and charge overnight, owning an electric car becomes a whole lot more difficult. And for the reasons we mentioned, it is less likely that those in Black and Latinx communities will own their own home and thus have a place to park and charge at night. As a side, while redlining is now technically illegal in many countries, including the US, you just have to take a look at the story of Carlette Duffy from Indianapolis, who had to hide her race and get a friend to show her home for an appraisal in order to get an unbiased, realistic valuation of how much her home was worth. To see those discriminatory practices in effect today, just follow the link below. If you are feeling uncomfortable about this video, you're not alone. This isn't an easy topic to discuss. It is uncomfortable, but we as a society, we need to have this discussion. In the EV world, the lack of level 2 public charging stations and level 3 powered charging stations in disinvested areas, often areas with communities that are predominantly black or brown, means that entire communities are effectively discouraged from buying an electric vehicle, even if some of its community members can afford, for example, a brand new Tesla. The problem is apparent among indigenous communities too, where a lack of EV charging stations and infrastructure effectively prohibits many native communities from even contemplating electric vehicles as a personal or mass transit solution. So let's look at the Greater Los Angeles area, an area the Rocky Mountain Institute has used to demonstrate just how stark the disparity between EV charging infrastructure and median income is. Entire swathes of LA have little to no EV infrastructure, and they are areas that have traditionally been disinvested. They are also areas with the poorest health, much of it caused by poor air quality, poor healthcare, and the lowest medium income. Frankly, these communities are the ones that would benefit the most from EV adoption. And they're also communities where gig economies are quickly becoming a lifeline for people needing a second job or more flexible working hours than a traditional job. In a 2017 survey from the Bureau of Labour Statistics, gig economy, or contingent workers, were far more likely to be younger and from Black, Indigenous, Pacific Islander or Asian communities than so-called traditional workforces. Uber and Lyft, whatever you think of them, have been working to make it easier for those drivers to get behind the wheel of a car so that they can drive for the service. But as I am sure you already know, drivers for Uber and Lyft don't earn a whole lot of money for their work. And if they also have to pay for maintenance and fuel for their vehicles, they do, then that profit margin gets smaller. But if you drive an EV for a ride-sharing service, you're going to end up with more in your pocket as daily operational costs are far lower, especially if you can find a good deal on a used EV, and assuming you can charge. Which brings me to the crux of the problem. Rideshare services are pledging to go fully electric in the next decade, and in states like California, that's going to be a legal requirement too. But without proper infrastructure deployment, rideshare operators with electric vehicles will naturally avoid areas with no infrastructure they can use. Data from existing EV operators on these services already shows that very seriously. The solution, says the RMI, is to encourage full deployment of charging stations with provision across all regions. And I'm going to add, engaging with communities to ask them where charging infrastructure needs to be placed, rather than acting without consultation, because that in of itself comes with a whole set of problems. Rideshare services, who are earning a lot of money from their drivers, could be in the perfect position to support an equitable rollout of charging stations. They have the money to invest in truly accessible, truly affordable charging stations that entire communities and their drivers can use. And in doing so, they can also ensure that they have as broad a service coverage as possible, while meeting emissions targets and avoiding pesky fines for not complying with regulations. Without appropriate charging station rollout, without equitable involvement, and without charging regulations to encourage rather than discourage public and on-street charging provision for those who do not have off-street parking and charging available for them, rideshare services and the very electrification of the fleet will become more, not less, divisive. And making that happen is going to require a lot of teamwork from everyone. But that's for another video that we're working hard on. That's it for today. Please do hit subscribe and the bell if you haven't yet, as it stops YouTube from doing questionable things with our content. And make sure that you've subscribed both to this channel, Take Two, and Transport Evolved Shorts. There are links below. Thanks on behalf of the entire TE crew go out to the folks on my right for being our $15 to $49 a month Patreon supporters. Special thanks to our $50 a month patrons, that's Guido Drahoa, Brophy Wolf, Anonymous Freak, Regine Fellows, Kyle Hodgson, Gordon C, Paul Conway, Laura Sanborn, Anthony Coates, Denny Hyde, Shawnee Wader, and Tazza in the Gong. And our deepest gratitude to our $100 a month Patreon supporters. They are John Lyons, Marcel Ward, Reggie Watts, JP Fagerback, Will Graylin, and Ian. If you would like to join the ranks of truly wonderful supporters, you'll find links below to Patreon, Bitcoin, and Ko-fi. You can chat with the team and TE fans over at Discord, and if you'd like to buy some TE swag, just point yourself over to our Redbubble store. Our new Pride designs, just like this one, are now in stock, and all proceeds from the sale of these go this month to the Trevor Project. Thanks for joining me, and as always, keep evolving!